We've got a bit of tea leaf reading coming out of the Supreme Court today, with the justices appearing to lean toward backing President Trump in a case that could seriously broaden how much authority he holds as president. The court heard arguments today on whether the president can remove a member of the Federal Trade Commission without needing a reason. Basically, can he fire someone from the FTC? And you might think, okay, so what? Why does that matter? Well, it matters because if the president wins, it would essentially wipe out the idea of agencies like the FTC being independent. It would overturn a 90-year-old precedent called Humphrey's executor. Stay with us here, because Chief Justice John Roberts actually questioned whether that precedent still makes sense. Listen to this. Humphrey's executor, he said, is just a dried husk of whatever people used to think it was, because even in the original opinion, the powers of the agency it talked about were incredibly small. So here's what actually went down today. And honestly, this could be one of the most dangerous moments for American democracy we've seen in a long time. I'm not exaggerating. The Supreme Court heard arguments in a case that could reshape how the federal government functions from top to bottom. I'm talking about Trump versus Slaughter. This case is about whether Trump gets to fire the leaders of independent federal agencies anytime he wants, for any reason he chooses, with zero limits. Think about what that really means. Independent federal agencies like the Federal Trade Commission, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Securities and Exchange Commission. These agencies are supposed to be shielded from political interference. They're supposed to make decisions based on evidence, facts, and expertise, not based on what the president personally wants. They exist to protect consumers. They exist to regulate businesses fairly. They exist to keep the economy safe and balanced. That's their entire purpose. But before we go any further, let's be honest for a second, mainstream media isn't exactly trustworthy anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to actually stay ahead of the news cycle, join our free newsletter. We'll deliver the headlines to your inbox daily. Just click the link in the description. And if you want to support what we're doing, join us. Be part of the community that cares about the truth. Alright, back to the video. I want to bring in our Supreme Court reporter, Lawrence Hurley, who's with us now. Professor Hurley, good to have you. Break this down for us, because what's so interesting, setting aside the legal jargon, is that if the court sides with President Trump, it essentially moves him much closer to the kind of strongman presidency he's always wanted. Yeah. I mean, the plain English explanation isn't easy when you're dealing with this alphabet soup of federal agencies, but the reality is these agencies have huge effects on people's everyday lives. They handle things like labor relations. They oversee product safety. Tons of obscure agencies with broad powers were set up by Congress specifically to be insulated from the politics of the moment. And if the president wins this case, that insulation disappears. The president would have far more authority over these agencies, and that may not even be the end of it. There could be more to come that pushes these agencies even further under presidential control and strips away the protections they've traditionally had. But Trump is arguing that he should be allowed to fire the heads of these agencies whenever he wants. No restrictions. No need for cause. If he doesn't like what they're doing, if they're not loyal enough, if they're simply not following his lead, he wants to be able to fire them. And the Supreme Court is actually considering this argument seriously. The court is hearing arguments on whether the president should have this level of power over these agencies. Here's why this matters and why you should care even if you normally don't follow Supreme Court cases. This is about the structure of American government. This is about how the system itself is built.
This is about whether Congress can create independent agencies or whether the president gets control over everything in the executive branch. This is about whether you have neutral regulators protecting you or political appointees doing whatever the president wants. The case is Trump v. Slaughter, involving Rebecca Slaughter, the current chair of the FTC. And here's the twist: Trump appointed her in 2018 during his first term. But now he doesn't want her there because she has Democratic ties and she actually believes in agency independence. She thinks the FTC should remain separate from presidential control. She's not going to simply follow Trump's directives, and Trump can't stand that. So he's arguing that he should be allowed to remove her because she's not loyal to him. He's saying the president should have total removal power with no limits. And the Supreme Court is genuinely considering this. And here's where things get wild. In May 2025, just a few months ago, the Supreme Court issued an ensign opinion, meaning the entire court agreed without attaching any justice's name. In that decision, the court basically said the president has the right to remove executive officers without cause, unless the law specifically says otherwise. And because Congress didn't include specific exceptions for some agencies, the president can remove those leaders anyway. Justice Kagan dissented. She said the majority has effectively handed full control of these agencies to the president. She wrote that the majority seems eager to overturn nearly a century of precedent meant to protect agency independence. She's essentially saying the conservative majority is tearing down 90 years of constitutional law that kept these agencies free from political pressure. Now think about what that means. Really think about the consequences. If Trump gets this power, if the Supreme Court rules in his favor, then Trump controls the agencies. What happens to consumer protection? What happens to antitrust enforcement? What happens to environmental protection? What happens to worker safety? All of that evaporates if Trump can directly control these agencies with zero limitations. And here's the part that really shows what's going on. Trump is already firing agency leaders even before the Supreme Court makes an official ruling. The court has been issuing emergency decisions allowing him to do it anyway. They're basically signaling that they're okay with this. So Trump is already taking control of these agencies, and the Supreme Court is allowing it even though laws say he can't. This isn't theoretical. This isn't hypothetical. This is happening right now. And today's arguments are about whether to make it official and permanent, whether to declare this level of presidential power constitutional. This is one of those moments where the structure of American government is being rewritten right in front of us, and most people have no idea it's happening. Alright, so let's break down the legal issues here because it's complicated but crucial. The case centers on presidential removal power, whether the president can fire people in independent agencies without restrictions. Trump argues the Constitution gives him full authority over the executive branch, so he should be able to remove anyone he wants, no limitations. And the Supreme Court is taking this argument seriously. The reason this is even possible is because of who's on the court now. Trump appointed 3 justices, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett, forming part of a 6-justice conservative majority. And this conservative majority has been signaling for years that they want to expand presidential power. They want the president to have more direct control over the government. In that ensigned May 2025 opinion, the court said the president can remove executive officers without cause unless Congress explicitly says otherwise. Before, the burden was on the president to justify firing someone. Now the burden is on Congress to justify protecting them. That shift gives the president far more power than before. Justice Kagan wrote a blistering dissent, saying the majority has effectively handed these agencies to the president by dismantling nearly a century of legal precedent going back to the 1935 Humphreys executor case.
In that 1935 case, FDR tried to fire an FTC commissioner just because he didn't like him. The Supreme Court said no, you can't do that. Congress has the authority to create independent agencies, and the president cannot remove their leaders at will. That case has been the foundation for independent agencies ever since. But now, the Supreme Court is signaling that Humphrey's executor might be wrong. They're suggesting the president should have unrestricted removal power. Rebecca Slaughter, whom Trump appointed in 2018, is now someone Trump wants gone because she won't just follow orders. And since there's a law saying the FTC chair can only be fired for cause, Trump is arguing that law is unconstitutional. Here's what's even more striking. Trump is already acting like he has this power, and the Supreme Court is already letting him get away with it through emergency rulings. Now imagine what happens if the court makes this permanent. The FTC is supposed to be independent. The chair is supposed to make decisions based on expertise, not presidential preference. But if Trump gets this power, he'll appoint someone loyal to him, someone who won't make independent decisions, someone who will simply do what Trump wants. That's bad for consumers. It's bad for antitrust enforcement. It's bad for protecting people from corporate abuse. And it won't stop with the FTC. If Trump wins, he controls the EPA, the SEC, the CFPB, all the agencies meant to protect the public and keep the economy fair. What happens to environmental protections if Trump controls the EPA? What happens to worker safety under OSHA? What happens to food safety under the FDA? What happens to financial enforcement under the SEC? Everything gets flipped upside down. Instead of protecting the public, these agencies become tools to help Trump's allies and harm his opponents. And it won't just be Trump. Every future president, Republican or Democrat, would inherit this power. This isn't just about Trump. This is about completely transforming how the federal government will work for decades. Congress's power gets hollowed out. Congress becomes almost irrelevant if the president can override any law by firing whoever he wants. If Trump wins, he will use this power aggressively. He'll replace the FTC chair with someone who stops antitrust enforcement. He'll replace the EPA head with someone who guts environmental rules. He'll replace SEC leaders with loyalists who don't pursue corporate crime. And any laws that say these agencies are independent become meaningless because the Supreme Court would be saying the Constitution gives the president removal power no matter what. This is basically saying the president's constitutional authority overrides anything Congress passes. And this is all happening at a moment when Trump is already moving to fire thousands of government workers under something called RIF, reductions in force, to replace them with loyalists. If Trump wins this case, it gives him the legal cover he needs to reshape the federal government in his image. The federal government becomes fully politicized. Career officials get replaced with loyalists. Agencies become tools of the president. Independence disappears. Checks and balances collapse. And once you give the president this power, you can't take it back. Every future president will have it. That's why this case matters. That's why it's one of the biggest cases the Supreme Court is dealing with right now. Because it's not just about whether Trump can fire Rebecca Slaughter, it's about the architecture of American government itself. Next time, we're going to dig into Trump's broader plan to fire thousands of federal employees and rebuild the entire government workforce the way he wants, because this FTC case is just the legal justification for what he's already preparing to do.